This talk is called Dene Ts'ili, which means being Dene, and I'm very obviously not Dene. And I guess the fact that I'm presenting on a topic like this in a space like this is actually an indicator of all kinds of predicaments that I find myself in on a regular basis, and is actually in the topic of, actually core to what I want to talk about today. So I am somewhat uncomfortable, probably healthily uncomfortable, being a non-Aboriginal person talking on this subject, and had hoped that Walter Bea could be here because he is truly co-author of a lot of the ideas that are going to come out of this discussion. And Doris Tanaton, who was a key researcher, community researcher during the time that we were working with the Sonoka program. And also absent is the graduate student who just recently actually delivered a report that is extremely insightful and provocative and interesting on some of the preliminary thoughts that emerged from her research that was supported by the Sonoka program. So talking about my discomfort about being who I am, giving this talk, I'd like to also say I'm really glad to be here because it's rare to be in a space with people who are clearly engaged, both engaged researchers and activists, and who see so clearly the intersection between social research and policy. And that being said, I think there are a lot of other discussions going on in both the large and small communities of the North that are of great relevance to this group, going on among Indigenous people. But the people who are engaged in these discussions are not here, partly because they're not using the standard language of social economy. And I want to express appreciation for Lois Little's comment on that yesterday, that they're not talking about voluntarism, co-ops, social capital, and civil society, but rather those people are using their own it's not just about language, they're using their own concepts to describe a part of their lives that's extremely important to them, and that Walter Bea has crystallized. I think the closest concept that we've been able to come up with is Dene Ts'ili in the Satutene dialect, being Dene. And that is an extremely, we found, complex concept, and is causing us to think not so much in terms of answers right now, but more in terms of questions. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. So, so in some ways, the disconnect that we see about the conversations that are going on outside this room and the conversations that are going on inside this room, some of which are being bridged by the research that's being done by the graduate students, is part of our research question, I guess, that we're still exploring. So there are two parts to what might be discussed in relation to the research that's gone on over the last while in Dene. One is perhaps about the predicament of research itself and research methodologies, how we come to learn about aspects of community life that some might call social economy. And the second thing is what we've learned about social economy through a focus on stories. I guess I was interested in talking about the how, which people have alluded to here and there through their presentations over the last couple of days. Partly because it seems to me that there are a lot of resonances between the challenges of working in community-based research and the challenges in that we heard in yesterday's panel about trying to maintain social economy organizations in a place like Yellowknife. So our research through the Social Economy Network, for example, was challenged by the fact that we had funding for a graduate student, but not funding for community staff or community participants. So we had to pull together a patchwork of funding pots, each of which had their own, came along with their own kind of tied concepts. It was tied aid in the sense that, you know, for example, we were working on climate change, health, and social economy, all combined, trying to address concepts that don't exist in the Dene, in Dene dialect. None of those three concepts. At the same time maintain a truly strong community sense of governance over the research and strategic coherence, I guess, to the research. So that was extremely challenging, and we ended up with a scenario whereby there was a certain kind of basically our work was engaged in supporting a wage labor situation with our community staff, as well as attempting to work on Dene ways of being that are contradictory to a wage structure, and we were working with inside ways of thinking as well as academic, externally derived ways of thinking. We were dealing with all kinds of elements of fragmentation and tension that are engaged in the transition to self-government within the community of Dene at the same time as well. So it was a very fascinating context to work in, a context of where people were really challenged to think about both the change that's going on in the environment and the society, as well as continuities that allow people to maintain their sense of identity and direction. And in that process, we began to try and make a shift from, well, it evolved that we felt we needed to make a shift from what we had originally been practicing under the mentorship of Joan Ryan way back in the early days. Joanne also was a kind of a mentor in the early days as well when I first arrived in 1999, to more of an experiment in Indigenous research methodologies, which are hybrid but take Indigenous concepts and ways of creating and sharing knowledge as the starting point. So we were also attempting to work at different scales, and Walter was a real key to this, in that we wanted to understand what was going on within Dene, but we also felt a really strong need to engage in dialogue with different communities. Particularly, there were certain issues that allowed us to, were kind of venues for this. The issue of caribou stewardship being a really critical one during that period. On everybody's minds in the Sahtu region and beyond in the Northwest Territories. And so that allowed us to actually understand how our thinking within Dene related to, for example, the thinking that was emergent from For Good Hope. And that's kind of bridges the work that I had been doing with Anne Marie Jackson with Roger's work, and into broader forums around caribou stewardship and a series of talking circles that Walter co-facilitated on caribou stewardship. So we found, I guess what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about some of the key things that we found, because I hardly have any time left. And I'm going to do that by way of a diagram, which is, again, it's partly finding, and I need to recognize Walter's authorship in this finding, and partly research questions. So if you could go to the next slide. So this is familiar to Frances Abel because she was part of this process of developing some research questions surrounding what it means to be Dene in the contemporary context, and how story, song, and understandings of concepts of place inform that process of being Dene at different levels. So this diagram is developed from an earlier concept that Walter credits to his grandfather. Really what it attempts to do is talk about what it means to be Dene at different levels of understanding, from the performative to the social ecological, where you see leadership, meaning, and place, to some of the critical foundations in social analysis and culture, governance and relationships and language, which have been really challenged by contemporary change in the environment and in land claims structures and institutions, to the domain that's in the green outer ring there of law, philosophy, that's law in the Dene sense, hard to translate exactly. Land in the deepest spiritual and philosophical sense, Dirinenek, and Nehwetzine, which is spirituality. And so what we want to do is continue to explore what have turned out to be the huge challenges in translating Dene ways of knowing and being into policy. So the title of our program was Stories and Songs as Policy for that reason. That's why there was the title at the beginning. And what we found is that although there is still a lot of vitality in the stories and songs, and Doris Tanaton, who had hoped to be here this morning, would have been able to describe some of the really interesting processes that she went through in the school, bringing elders and youth together in story exchanges, where the youth began to represent the stories back to the elders, taking ownership of those stories, using their own media, including digital storytelling, radio documentary, plays, posters, etc., a variety of different formats. And she is very inspiring when she talks about this, because she feels that that's kind of critical to the youth as in their development as new leaders. But the power of those stories in terms of the development of institutions of self-government, in terms of the development of policy around, for example, something as critical as caribou stewardship, has proven to be much more challenging. And that's the level that Walter Bea has been struggling with and working at, chipping away at, I guess is a word, precisely because it's after that major legacy of colonialism and residential schools, etc., it seems that non-Dene legal modalities of thinking, non-Dene ways of creating knowledge and doing research, including numbers, including quantitative research, have achieved a lot more compelling kind of force within the communities and beyond. And people are thinking very strategically about how they create knowledge in a way that they feel will make impact at the level of the GNWT and at the federal government level. And other ways of knowing have kind of fallen to the side when it comes to policy development. So that's a challenge that Walter is extremely committed to take on. The community is looking at the possibility of trying to have a much longer term research strategy that doesn't have to engage in this predicament of kind of fragmented funding sources and year-to-year funding. And so we'll see where that goes, but we have really appreciated the chance offered by this program to think about ways of affirming that part of Dene life that goes beyond the institutions that are handed to us by the federal government and the territorial government. Thanks.